Okay, good morning, everyone. Looks like we have a good amount of folks on already, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our November Brunch and Learn webinar. I hope everyone is staying warm out there and has dug out of the snow after last week's early winter snowfall. Today we're going to talk about school board committees. It's possible we may not go the full hour unless we have a lot of questions, which I strongly encourage. Ask questions as we go along here today, but we should have time at the end as well for any final questions before we say goodbye for the morning. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen and ask questions through the Q&A feature. If you're having any problems with the webinar or if you can't hear me, please put any concerns in the chat and we'll try our best to monitor that as well. I think I'm on my own today for staff, so I'll do my best to monitor everything as we go along here. But again, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I think it makes for a much more valuable discussion if we have some participation from you all. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We wanted to cover school board committees today. We seem to always get a lot of questions about school board committees, how to create them, when they're created, compliance with open meetings laws, removal of committee members, who should be on the committee. All of those questions I'm going to try and cover for you today. So there we go. So what is the purpose of school board committees? Well, kind of very simply, they're created to do work for or complete a task for the board. The responsibility of a board committee can really vary depending on the needs of the board, but these are kind of the general purposes that they typically serve when they're created. So they're created to do kind of, I don't like to call it the grunt work, but it's kind of the more in-depth work that might be necessary for the board to complete. Its roles and responsibilities for the district. So they might assign or create a committee to look at an issue and study it in greater detail so that the committee can then make recommendations to the full board regarding action it should take regarding public business. And then it also is a way to divide up that responsibility amongst board members, maybe certain staff members, maybe outside third parties that have particular expertise. So it's really, they're really used to help the board complete its work in a better manner. Interestingly enough, you won't see any specific mention of committees, specifically school board committees in the Century Code, but there is a definition of that kind of relates to a committee in terms of including it as a governing body in Chapter 4404, which is the open records, open meetings requirements are most of those are contained in that chapter. And so in section 4404, 17.1 subsection 6, that's the definition section. In the definition of a governing body, it includes when a governing body assigns responsibility or delegates responsibility to 2 or more people, that is also considered a governing body for purposes of open meetings and open records requirements. We'll get to that in a little bit more detail, but in terms of what a committee is, you're not going to find other than that, you're not going to find a specific definition in North Dakota law. A lot of the guidance that we have regarding the creation of committees by public entities and school boards in particular come from Attorney General opinions and the manuals and guides that they put out. So anytime a school board delegates some kind of responsibility or task to 2 or more people, that's when a committee is created. You don't need to actually call it a committee in order for it to be a committee. It doesn't even require formal board action to create a committee. It can basically be created by general consensus among the board members. It can include board members, or it may not include board members in order to be a committee. So how are committees created? Well, they, like I said, they can be created by board action, specific board action, or just simply consensus amongst the board that, you know, a group of 2 or more people are going to take on some kind of responsibility or task for the board. It doesn't even have to be a specific board action or a board motion saying, you know, I move to create committee X. It can be simply a consensus amongst the board that happens through discussion of a particular issue. But most often for school boards, they're created by board policy. And specifically, our template policy that covers board committees is policy BBBB, so for the 4 Bs. And that is a pretty straightforward policy. It basically allows the board to name what we refer to as standing committees. Those are kind of the more permanent, consistent committees that the board creates to assign certain responsibility to. We'll cover that in a second here. It also covers you know, the creation of special committees or ad hoc committees, you know, that you might not be you might not be using on a indefinite basis, but maybe there's some kind of special task or project that's coming up that you want a committee to handle. I got a question. Would tasks assigned to 2 or more administrators be a committee that would require agenda and minutes? Great question. So it kind of depends. We'll get into this in a second, but when we talk about administrative committees, but anytime the board, either by board action, by board policy, or by consensus amongst the board, delegates any kind of task or responsibility to 2 or more individuals, regardless of who those individuals are, generally speaking, a committee is going to be formed. So in that sense, Lucas, for your question, if the board, either by board policy, by board action, or by board consensus, delegates some sort of task or responsibility to 2 administrators, like a committee has likely been formed, a board committee, and then therefore you would need to comply with the open meetings requirements, which we're going to talk about here in a second, but that was a great question. Typically, if you have our template policy, committee assignments or appointments are made by the board president, but subject to the approval of the full board. So what that looks like in practice is the board president would nominate individuals to serve on standing or special committees that are created by the board, and then the board would ultimately approve those assignments or appointments. And then typically your policy should have some sort of mention of removal procedures, how to remove individuals from a committee. And removal can be for various reasons. It could be simply the maybe the individual is just not available anymore to serve on the committee. It's possible the individual has engaged in some sort of misconduct or malfeasance that would necessitate removal. And that typically just requires board action. Some policies require a 2/3 majority in order to make appointments to committee and also to remove members from a committee. Frankly, I don't really like the 2/3 majority because I think, you know, the board should be able to create committees when necessary and to remove individuals when the need arises without having to achieve that 2/3 majority. But at the end of the day, there's no hard and fast rules about this. There's nothing in Century Code that dictates how committees have to be formed, what removal procedures there are. It's typically left up to the board's discretion on how the board wants to handle that. But it is recommended that your board policy cover these items at a minimum. And if you have our board policy, our template policy on board committees, it includes all of those items. Another questions. So members can be identified by the superintendent, but president presents for board approval. I assume, Benita, that you're talking about appointments to a committee. So again, there's no hard and fast rules in terms of how this is supposed to work under the law, in terms of how you make appointments to a committee. Our template policy and most districts' policies in other states delegate the responsibility to the board president to propose appointments essentially to the board, and then the board ultimately approves those appointments. Now, when the board president makes those appointments, they should consider the needs of the board. They should consider the wants of the board and the individual board members in terms of who should be staffing those committees. They should take advice from their superintendent on maybe who would be good folks to put on a committee, especially if you're going to be putting non-board members on your committee. Seek advice from your superintendent and your administrators on who might be good. You know, if you have a staff member that's going to be on, or maybe an outside third party, a patron, a member of the business community, you'd want to take some recommendations. But at the end of the day, the board policy dictates that the appointments are made by the board president and ultimately approved by the board. Another question, if there is a district-wide committee and 2 board members sit on the committee, does this require agenda and minutes? So I'm not sure what the distinction between just a general committee and a district-wide committee. The law doesn't differentiate committees in that way. But if it's a kind of how the AG has handled it is if it is a board created committee, either by specific board action, board policy, board consensus, any delegation of responsibility or task from the board, that is going to be a board committee that is going to be subject to open meetings and open records laws. So notice of the meetings, public access, taking minutes. That's what makes those committee meetings subject to open record or open meetings requirements, is when the board delegates any kind of task or responsibility to 2 or more individuals. Those individuals do not have to be board members. They can be outside third parties. They could be your administrators. They could be board members. It doesn't matter who the individuals are in order to create a board committee that's subject to the open records or open meetings requirement. So if a district-wide committee is created by the board, again, you don't even have to call it a committee. And it's delegating responsibility to 2 or more folks, board members or not. Yes, they have to, you know, create notices, agendas, take minutes, allow public access to their meetings. So hopefully that answers your question. Another question, at our last board meeting, we assigned a committee to address a building issue. One of the board members called me and asked if he could get off because at this time he just doesn't have the time to meet and would like to get off. Can we remove him and add someone else right now, or do we need to have a special meeting to make the change? I'm assuming we need to have a meeting, but I figured I would ask. So I assume that this, again, from your question, it appears that this the board created this committee. And so it would require at least board consensus to make the change. Frankly, you likely have, if you have our template policy, it does cover removal procedures. And that just simply requires the board to take action to remove an individual, and then you can reappoint. So yes, the board would have to have a meeting. You couldn't, you know, make that change without having a meeting. Great questions. I'm glad we're having some good questions here. Okay, so I had mentioned that there's kind of different types of committees in terms of their purpose and whether they're more permanent or indefinite, or whether they are created for special purpose and are temporary nature. So the more permanent, indefinite types of committees are generally referred to as standing committees. These are, again, committees that are more permanent in nature. They're created by the board to address the regular business of the board, issues, topics that are part of your regular business. And so these are typically like your policy committee, your curriculum committee, personnel committee, facilities, finance. Those are the types of committees that we generally have, that we generally think of as standing, because it's the type of work that's always before the board, and so they perform consistent work for the board. Hiring committee is could be a standing committee, or could be an ad hoc or a special committee. It kind of depends on how you conduct your hiring in your district. There are some boards that have standing hiring or personnel committees that assist the board in the hiring process. So some boards like to have some participation in the actual screening and hiring process for teachers, for example. And so they will create a hiring committee that consists of a board member or two, depending on the size of the board, likely your administrator, maybe your business manager, and they will do the screening and the hiring, you know, the pre-offer work for the board in terms of screening applicants, gathering, you know, determining job postings, those kinds of things. And so some boards have standing hiring committees, but some boards don't do that. They leave their hiring of the screening procedures to their administrators, and then the administrator then ultimately goes to the board to get the hiring approval for teachers, but the board members don't actually participate in the screening process. So, and again, that's up to the discretion of the board as to how they want to handle something like that. So a hiring committee might be created as a special committee if a board is hiring, say, a principal or a superintendent, and the board doesn't have a hiring committee as a standing committee, but they want to have a committee that handles that particular hiring process. So that would be an example of where a hiring committee is not a standing committee, but is likely more of a special committee. Question, will this recording be posted on NDSBA site for future reference? Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yes, like all of our Brunch and Learn webinars, they will be recorded and put on the website for future reference. So thank you for reminding me of that. Can another board member fill in for a committee member who can't attend their committee meeting? So if the board has not made any concession for that, in the sense of it's in their policy, or maybe when they created the committee, they maybe chose alternates to fill in when a committee member is not there, I would say the answer is probably no. The board creates the committee, delegates the responsibility, and then fills the committee with the appropriate members. So if the board has not taken any, factored that in creating the committee, then the answer is probably no. One thing, and I was going to cover this a bit later, but I think it's helpful to answer the question that was just asked, is anytime a committee works just like, once a board committee is created, for purposes of open meetings, it works just like the full board. So anytime, in order to do business, in order to do committee work, all you need is a quorum or more of the committee members there to meet to do committee work. So that's something to take into account when you're staffing these committees, and the time commitment that might be involved. Obviously, if you want your committee members to be attending every committee meeting, but obviously life throws things in our way that sometimes we can't make commitments. And just like board members can't always attend board meetings despite their best efforts. So you should factor that in when you're staffing your committees. Frankly, a committee of two is difficult, because if one person can't be there, well, then you only have one other person. And so you can't really conduct business that way. So, you know, even though a committee is created anytime, you know, any kind of responsibility is delegated to 2 or more folks, you probably want to have more than 2 people. And then it would give you some leeway if committee members aren't able to meet, you know, make a particular meeting. It won't hold up the committee work. But in answer to your question, no, you probably can't just you know, another board member sit in for that committee member if they haven't been given that ability by the board. A good question. Can I review outside committee discussion among committee members and the law, including straw voting? Yes, I will do that when we get to the open meeting. So I'm going to leave that question out there hanging. And then when I get to that part of the discussion, I will definitely address that. That's a great question. So standing committees, just to get back, those are generally created by board policy. Again, our policy BBBB covers standing committees and would allow the board to designate what standing committees it would like to have in place. Those standing committees are generally created or reaffirmed at the annual meeting in July. Members are generally appointed at that annual meeting in July, and then typically the terms of those committee members last 1 year until the next annual meeting in July, where the board will then, you know, reaffirm the existence of the committee or the continuance of the committee, and then either reaffirm the current members continuing as committee members, or maybe add or substitute other members. Just like any committee, a standing committee can include board members, administration, other staff, patrons, business professionals, any individual that the board believes would be helpful to the work of the standing committee. Now, I will talk about some practice pointers or good best practices in staffing committees in a bit here, but the law doesn't restrict the board on who it would like to include on a committee, but there are some best practice pointers that I will get to in a second. Another question: when these types of committees meet, does the superintendent need to be present? So regardless of the committee, whatever issue it's working on, whatever you know, task it's been delegated, there's nothing that requires the superintendent to be at the meeting. Now, if the superintendent is a member of the committee, obviously that they should be there. But, you know, there's really nothing in the law that requires the superintendent to attend board meetings, but because of the nature of their job, they attend board meetings. They're the board's main advisor, chief advisor. They're responsible for day-to-day management of the district. It obviously is, you know, important that they attend board meetings. That might be the case for committee meetings too, that they are not actually on as a member of the committee. But that can vary depending on what committee, what the committee is doing, what the work of the committee is. It might not necessitate the superintendent attending every meeting, but I will say that the superintendent should be kind of keeping track generally of the work of the committees, because again, they are the chief advisor of the board. And so when committees are making recommendations to the board for action, the board is likely going to be looking to their superintendent for advice and guidance on, you know, whether the board should adopt that recommendation of the committee. So the superintendent should be kept at least abreast of the work of the committees, even if they're not attending every meeting. Great question. Okay, so I think it's pretty common that most boards create some kind of standing committees. Very common. And I think there's a lot of good things that standing committees, or just even committees in general, can do for the board. But, you know, I'm also not I don't think there's a one size fits all approach here when it comes to standing committees in particular. I think you need to do what you feel is best for your district as a board. So a couple of things to keep in mind when you're deciding whether to add another standing committee or utilize standing committees at all. You know, one thing to keep in mind is, depending on how you staff your committees, Especially if you have a 5-member board, sometimes those committees aren't actually useful because a lot of the work that those committees can do can actually be done by the board. And it really kind of just depends on your governance model that you utilize in your district. How much authority you've delegated to your superintendent, for example, by board policy can kind of cut down on the need for a committee. But, you know, I do encourage you to think about, are these committees that we're creating actually useful for our board? Another thing that standing committees can do is encourage micromanagement. For example, hiring committees, finance committees, personnel committees. If the work of those types of committees kind of gets board members more intimately involved in the day-to-day operations of the district, which in and of itself is not bad. It's not bad for board members to know about the day-to-day operations of the district and to have some insight into that. But it can start to encourage micromanagement. And so where board members are then, or even just other committee members are kind of getting out of their lane, so to speak. And really where this kind of impacts is, you know, the roles and responsibility, the division of work between the board and their administration. So that's one thing to be aware of. When you're creating these standing committees, they do tend to encourage that micromanagement. So that's something, doesn't mean you shouldn't, that's a reason not to create standing committees if you think that they'll be helpful, but it is something to watch out for if you do create those standing committees. The other potential con for a standing committee is they do create more work for board members. It is very common for committees to be staffed by 1 or 2 board members, in addition to maybe your superintendent, maybe some other staff members, business manager. So, you know, obviously board members, you all have full-time jobs. Just attending regular board meetings and doing the regular work of the board is a time commitment already. Creating additional committees and staffing them with board members creates additional work for board members on top of all of the responsibility you have already. So think about that when you're creating these committees, when you're staffing these committees. Are you going to actually be able to, are your board members actually going to be able to commit to the time, the additional time commitment that is created by these standing committees? Another thing that I see often with committee work is it does create factions on the board. So you might have 2 board members that are assigned to a particular committee, and they, you know, they work a lot together on the work of the committee, and then it can start to create maybe a faction amongst those board members that can impact how the board functions. Doesn't mean that factions are always negative. They can be a positive thing and can bring good issues in front of the board, but they can also encourage some, you know, negativity, some toxic work relationships amongst board members. So it is something to be aware of and to watch out for. The other thing that committee work can do is, so when one of the purposes of a committee is to kind of divide up the work of the board on certain issues or categories or topics. And so the committee members get to, you know, kind of dig into the meat, so to speak, of the issue or the task or the topic that they're assigned. And they really get to learn about that. And then they make recommendations to the board. But the non-committee board members don't always get the benefit of that work and that detailed information. And so one impact that the committee work can have is that not all board members have access to the same information at the same time regarding the business of the board. And so that's something that committees can kind of create. And so it's something, again, not to discourage the creation of standing committees, but it is something to watch out for. Another question, do I recommend rotating members on committees? Ours never leave or move committees, and it becomes micromanaging and control that other members don't see and understand. I think if you're having that result, micromanaging, control, maybe faction creating, I think then yes, some rotation on and off those committees or change up of those committees can be helpful to work against those types of negative impacts of committee work. So I think if that's happening, then yes, I would consider, you know, alternating board members off of those standing committees. But the reality is, you know, I think some board members are assigned to certain committees because they're either one, interested in that particular part of board business, or they're good at it, or they have a particular expertise. You know, maybe they have an HR background, and so they're good on the personnel committee because they can kind of understand how the HR world works. Keeping that individual on that committee, you know, year after year isn't a bad thing in and of itself. But I think if you're having those results of micromanaging, control issues, then I think that would be a good time to consider whether it's time to rotate off and serve in another capacity, for example. You guys are having great questions today. I'm happy about that. Okay, so I had mentioned standing committees and ad hoc or special committees. So the difference between the two is special committees are really only created for a special purpose or to take on a specific task. And that's usually temporary in nature. Really the only one that I can think of as a that I consistently see across districts is a construction project. So if you're, you know, building a new school or remodeling or improving, and it's you know, a sizable project, it is very common for the board to create a construction committee or a project committee for that particular project. And then in terms of, you know, what that committee does, that can vary. It can, you know, just handle a small portion of the project. It could be a committee that exists through, you know, from, you know, before the bond referendum is even put on the ballot all the way through to completion. And then kind of what their task is or what work they perform kind of depends on, you know, what the board would like them to do. And again, the board has a lot of discretion in determining what it would like the board, that committee to do. But a construction project committee is a very common special committee that I see across from district to district. Again, just like any standing committee, a special committee can include, you know, any two or more individuals that the board thinks would be helpful to the committee. You know, for construction projects, it's very common to have a board member or two, your lead administrator, you might even have your architect as part of your project committee, depending on, again, on the task or responsibility assigned or the work of the committee. You might have outside business professionals, maybe somebody in the community, a patron that has you know, construction knowledge. Maybe you'll have them on your committee. You really have a lot of leeway in who you want to task or with that responsibility, who you want to staff in your committee. For these kinds of special committees, once that task or project is complete, generally the committee disbands. I think that's something that could be determined before when the committee is created. The board can say, you know, once this task is complete, the committee will no longer delegate any responsibility to the committee, and the committee will automatically disband, or the board can take action to disband a committee once it believes that the work has been completed. Another question: if there's a committee meeting being conducted with 2 board members on the committee, can another board member come sit in the audience just to listen, or does that create a quorum in the case of a 5-member board? Great question, Colette. This is a common question that I get, and I'm going to cover it here in a second, so just bear with me. Okay, so before we move on to the kind of the open meetings requirements, because I know that's where a lot of our questions come from, and the 2 that I'm that I'm kind of holding on to are related to that. I just wanted to give you a couple of practice pointers on when you're creating committees, staffing committees. The first one actually relates to what Colette asked. I recommend that you have less than a quorum of your full board members on any one committee. Now, why is that? And it's really the problem that Colette is identified in her question. So the law, North Dakota law says that anytime a quorum or more of a governing board of an entity is gathered together regarding public business, a meeting occurs, and that triggers your responsibilities under the open meetings requirements. So again, I said, anytime a quorum or more of board members are gathered regarding public business, that could mean that they're simply there receiving information regarding public business. They don't even have to be actively discussing public business. They don't even have to be engaged in or take any formal action regarding public business. They could be simply sitting and receiving information that's related to the board's work, related to public business. So the reason why we recommend less than a quorum of board members is because we don't want to trigger a full board meeting by having more than a quorum or more of board members on your committees, because you are noticing the committee as a committee meeting. If a quorum or more of the full board is there, it is a full board meeting. And so likely you are not noticing it correctly. The other issue that it presents is that if you have more, so committees are generally not delegated final decision-making authority. And that's one of the things that is a practice pointer here, is you should not be delegating final decision-making authority to your committees as a board. And so if you have a quorum or more of your board members on a committee, that committee can take final decision that can bind the board, because the board is there. Enough board members are there to bind the board and bind the district. So that's another reason not to have a quorum or more of your board members on any one committee. Now, Colette's question kind of takes it a step further. So, okay, well, we only have 2 of our 5 board members on this committee. What happens if one of the board members who's not on the committee comes to the committee meeting and sits in the audience? Well, arguably, again, the board member doesn't have to be doing anything, engaging in the discussion, just by simply being there and receiving information about public business. Arguably, a quorum or more of board members are in a gathering regarding public business. And so a full board meeting is happening in terms of the definition of a meeting under North Dakota law. So we strongly discourage non-committee board members from attending committee meetings. I completely understand the desire to want to attend those committee meetings, because again, one of the potential cons of committee work is that the committee members get the benefit of digging into the details of the particular work that they're doing, but the other non-committee board members don't get the benefit of that. And so one of the things that can happen is that those non-committee board members want to attend those committee meetings so that they can kind of see what the work of the committee is doing. So again, we discourage attending those board meetings or those committee meetings. One of the things that you can do is make sure that your committees are reporting their work to the board in a way that benefits the board, or that in the way that the board needs it to, so that you don't have to attend those committee meetings. I mean, one of the benefits of the committees is to divide up the work of the board so that not all board members have to be involved in every aspect of the board's work. And so if a board member has to attend the committee meetings in order to understand, a recommendation that the committee is going to make so that they can take appropriate action, well, that really kind of defeats the benefit of having committees. So again, discourage that. A way to get that information is to have the committee be reporting back to the board, maybe providing information to individual board members in advance of the meetings so that they can understand some of the detailed information that the committee members are getting through their committee work. Okay. Okay, one question, what if they state that they are attending to listen as a parent? Well, I say this all the time. Just because you're a board member does not mean, and you have a student that attends the district, does not mean that you give up your status as a parent. So for example, if you need to meet with the teacher or with administration as a parent regarding your student, you can do that. However, you really can never permanently remove your board member hat, even in situations like that. So same goes for board meetings. And I think it's even an easier issue when it comes to board meetings. You can't take off your board member hat and say, I'm just a parent today when I'm at a board meeting or a committee meeting, because you aren't, the reality is you are an elected official, you are a board member. And for purposes of open meetings requirements, that I just don't think that's going to fly. So it's a little bit more of a nuanced issue when you're talking about, okay, I'm going to, as an individual board member, I'm going to go to the school and meet with my child's teacher to discuss some concerns. You don't completely remove your board hat. You need to be careful and always cognizant of the fact that you're a member of the board. You're ultimately one of the, you have the ability to impact this teacher's future employment, but it doesn't mean that you can't address issues as a parent. So I think it's a little bit of a more nuanced issue when we're talking about, those types of things versus going to a board meeting as a parent. Another practice pointer, committees, like I've said a couple of times yet this morning, they can include non-board members, but I really strongly urge you to be careful about staffing your committees with non-board members. Very common to do it, not discouraging at all, the practice at all, but I do encourage you to be careful about who you choose to be on your committees. So, when you're staffing your committees with non-board members, you want to look at, okay, is this person going to add particular expertise or add value to the work of the committee? So if it's an outside third party, do they have a particular expertise on committee work that will aid the committee in their work, which is why they should be on the committee. Very common to get parent input on, curriculum, on construction projects, on various things. But, how many parents should you have on the committee? Students. Might make a lot of sense to have a student representative on a committee, but make sure that you're, when you take those steps, that that person has some kind of particular expertise or is going to add value. Their perspective is going to add value to the work of the committee. So just something to keep in mind. Another issue is committee size. I've seen committees that are like 15 members. There's nothing wrong with it in terms of, from a legal perspective, you can have a 15-member committee, but I think it's pretty likely that a 15-member committee is going to have a hard time really wading through the task and responsibility that it needs to get done. I mean, how can you get anything done really with 15 people, 15 cooks in the kitchen, so to speak? So I really think, again, you don't want board committees to necessarily be 2 people, because again, that can create its own problems. But having 10, 15 people on a committee can be really difficult to actually wade through the work and get good work done in an efficient manner. So watch the size of your committees. Again, lastly, board should not be delegating any final decision-making authority to committees. That is something that the board should retain for itself. Okay, getting on to the open meetings portion, because this is a lot of where a lot of the questions come up. Board committees, just like the board itself, are subject to the open meetings requirements under North Dakota law. And again, the reason for this is that the definition of governing body of a public entity includes not only the established governing body, the school board of the school district, it also includes, by definition in law, any group of persons acting collectively pursuant to authority delegated by the governing body. So anytime the school board delegates authority to any group of persons, 2 or more persons, that's what a group is, 2 or more, acting collectively, that is then a governing body is created for purposes of open meetings. And if you think about it, the reason for that is, you know, the purpose of the open meetings and open records requirements is to provide transparency. It's to provide the public the ability to look into how the government is functioning, how funds are being spent. And so if you could just avoid that by simply delegating authority to a committee, that would completely erode the public's ability to look into what the government is doing and how it's spending taxpayer dollars. So that is why delegation of responsibility to 2 or more folks by a governing body creates a governing body in and of itself that must comply with the open meetings requirements. Okay. Okay, a couple more things. Anytime a board delegates any of its public business to 2 or more individuals, like I said, a committee has been formed. Don't need to call it committee, don't need to have a formal motion. All that is required is board consensus. So once that happens, a committee has been formed. You have to comply with the open meetings requirements. That includes notice of your meetings, public access to your meetings, taking minutes, all of the same open meetings requirements that your board must comply with also applies to those committees. If one board member delegates responsibility to 2 or more people, a committee isn't created because the governing body hasn't delegated responsibility. Anytime the governing body delegates responsibility to one individual, a committee is not created because you have to delegate responsibility to 2 or more folks in order for a committee to be created. So there might be circumstances where the board says, you know what, we want our superintendent to go out and do this. Not a committee because they're delegating to one person. If the board president says, you know, I really need some information about this particular issue so that I can make sure that I'm up to speed on something. So he goes out and asks superintendent and business manager, hey, can you go and gather this information for me? That delegation of responsibility by the board president does not in and of itself create a committee because it's a delegation by only the board president, not by the school board. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, getting back to the actual open meetings requirements. So anytime a quorum or more of the committee gathers regarding the committee work, a meeting is occurring. And so that's what triggers that open meeting requirements. So getting back to one of the questions, can we review outside committee discussion among committee members and the law? So same boundaries, responsibilities that apply to board members, discussions outside of a board meeting also apply to committees and committee members. So if, let's say, you have a 3-member committee, in order to have a meeting for purposes of open meetings requirements, only 2 of those committee members need to be gathered together regarding the committee work. So if you have those 2 committee members meeting at a coffee shop and discussing committee work, technically you have a meeting that's occurring that has to be noticed, open to the public, and minutes taken. So that's something to really keep an eye out for and to understand your boundaries as committee members. You know, because typically a discussion between 2 board members regarding board business isn't going to trigger an open meetings violation because the smallest board that you can have is a 5-member board, and so 2 out of 5 is not a quorum. So that's what those one-on-one conversations outside of meeting in and of itself generally don't trigger an open meetings violation. That can be different when it comes to committees because you can have less than 5 members on a committee. So those outside committee discussions can actually trigger open meetings violations easier than board members can regarding regular board business. So same issues with straw voting, so committees don't typically take formal votes, although they certainly can on, if you want to vote on which recommendation to make to the full board, you can vote on that at a committee meeting. But, the same rules apply. You shouldn't be, calling your individual committee members and taking a straw vote outside of committee meeting if that those communications are going to trigger an open meeting violation. So same rules apply as to committees as do the full board in terms of outside meeting discussions. A couple more questions. I submit committee meeting minutes in board monthly meeting packets to keep all members up to date on committee work. That was an anonymous post, but I think that's a great thing to do. So it's a way to keep non-committee board members apprised of what the committee is doing. Great thing to do. Another question, our CTE committee has one board member on it as they were asked by the CTE teachers who run it. How does this play out? Does this require notice, open meetings requirements? So again, the reason that the open meetings requirements apply to committees is when the board delegates responsibility to 2 or more folks. So if CTE teachers are the ones creating a committee, it's likely not a board committee, even if a member of that committee is a board member. If the board had no involvement in the establishment of that committee, then the open meetings requirements likely do not apply. You don't have to worry about that. That apply to the full board in terms of notice apply to the committee. So there is no minimum notice requirement for board meetings. Same goes for committee meetings. So if you need to schedule an emergency meeting, committee meeting, or a special, all committee meetings are special meetings for purposes of open meetings requirements. So across the board, anytime a committee meeting is happening, it's a special meeting for purposes of notice. So make that really clear. All are special meetings. So you have to comply with the special meeting notice requirements. No minimum notice. The more an argument can be made that you haven't actually provided public notice. So like, let's say it's 9:53 a.m. right now, and we decide, you know what, we want to have a committee meeting at 10 a.m. today. So we're going to hurry up and provide public notice 5 minutes, 6 minutes before the meeting. Are we actually providing public notice? Are we actually giving the public any opportunity to access the meeting? Probably not. So I would probably not schedule a special meeting or a committee meeting 5 minutes before you want to start it, and then provide the notice. But you can have emergency meetings. Whether committee meetings could qualify as emergency meetings is another question that I won't cover because we're running out of time. But kind of the same rules apply. There is the requirement for board meetings and committee meetings at any time. The timing of the notice is triggered by members of the governing body. So when members of the committee are essentially made aware of the time and location of the meeting, that's when notice has to be provided. So same as for regular board meetings and special board meetings, for committee meetings, same rules apply. Anytime the members of the governing body are provided notice of the meeting date and time and location, that's when the public notice has to go out. One step further, if a committee meeting is going on with 2 board members present, can other board members listen on the phone? Just like any board meeting, a board member can be present by telephone. The board member is gathered listening to public business, information regarding public business. I think arguably, yes, it still creates a problem. Now, can we take it further and further where, the committee members have no idea that that somebody has the other board member on the phone and they're listening? Again, I think there are ways for non-committee board members to get the information they want rather than kind of trying to jump through these hoops. That makes sense. Okay, following negotiations, the school board approves the teacher negotiated agreement. In that agreement is language that creates a committee. The language states that one of the members of the committee will be a board member who will serve as an advisory member. Other members are administrators and teachers. We have treated this as a committee that is subject to open meetings laws, right or wrong. So I can't give you a formal opinion through our discussion today. Okay, so it looks like the negotiated agreement creates a committee. And one of the board members is serving on the committee as an advisory member. I mean, the reality is that, you know, there's really no voting versus non-voting member on a committee. It's a committee for purposes of open meetings laws, if it qualifies as a committee for purposes, a board committee. So because this committee is created by the negotiated agreement, I think there's at least an argument that the board has created the committee because it has to approve the negotiated agreement. So again, I can't give you a formal opinion on that, but I think the answer is probably yes. When in doubt, comply with the open meetings requirements. That is a directive from the AG's office. You will see it in their open meetings manual. When there is a doubt whether a meeting is occurring or if it is a meeting, comply with the open meetings requirements. That is the safest bet. Our policy committee was recently formed and 2 board members are reviewing them. If we discuss the policy over Zoom, do we have to give notice of a meeting? It is considered a meeting because we aren't making final decisions, just reviewing the wording for final decision at our board meeting. So again, anytime the board delegates any responsibility or task to 2 or more folks, a committee is formed that must comply with the open meetings requirements. So if your committee is only 2 board members and it was something that was established, created by consensus or action by the board, then a committee has been created and must comply with the requirements. So if you meet over Zoom, it's likely a committee meeting. It has to be noticed, public access has to be provided, and minutes need to be taken. It doesn't matter if the committee isn't making final decisions. Frankly, I don't recommend that you ever delegate final decision-making authority to your committee. If they're discussing, a policy committee works a lot like this already. You know, have a couple of board members, maybe your superintendent, going through proposed policies and then making recommendations to the board. Anytime that committee meets, anytime a quorum or more of that committee meets, a meeting is occurring and you must comply with the open meetings requirements. You guys are just giving me great questions. I really appreciate this. So when you set your next board meeting, you need to post that immediately without an agenda. This must be relating to the timing of notice. So the law for regular meetings, the law doesn't require that that the notice include an agenda. But an agenda is preferred, and if you have an agenda, it should be included in the notice for regular meetings. For special meetings, you have to have the topics listed in the agenda in order to discuss those topics at the special meeting. Because committee meetings are special meetings, they're not regular meetings of the board, you have to include an agenda in your notice of the topics that you're going to be discussing. So when the responsibility or obligation to provide notice is triggered, whether we're talking about a board meeting or a committee meeting, when it's a special meeting, you need to have those topics in your notice. Doesn't mean you can't amend that notice, you know, in a timely fashion before the meeting if you need to add something, but you should have that agenda in your notice. Another question, if we have a committee meeting, does someone need to be there to take minutes, notes? So again, I would treat this just like any other board meeting. I understand that you probably don't want to have your business manager attending every committee meeting, because what I will say, if you have a number of committees, what that'll mean is your business managers are putting in a lot of overtime hours, which you will be required to pay a time and a half for. So, and frankly, you'll run your business manager ragged by doing that. So ultimately, the business manager by law is responsible for making sure that a record of all board proceedings, including committee meetings, are kept. But that doesn't mean that they have to attend every board meeting or every committee meeting. They can delegate that responsibility to somebody else to take the notes, even to prepare the minutes. But at the end of the day, they are ultimately responsible for making sure that those minutes are taken. That's their legal responsibility under North Dakota law. So yes, you should have somebody there, taking notes in order for minutes to be prepared for the meeting, but that doesn't mean it has to be your business manager every time. Before we say goodbye, I wanted to cover an issue that recently provided some additional clarification by a recent AG opinion, which I really appreciated. And I wrote a bulletin article on it last month in October, I think it was, or at least the month before. So what about committees created by administration? And these are called administrative committees typically, or superintendent's committees. As I said, there was a recent opinion, which I have referenced here on the slide, from the North Dakota Attorney General, that looked at whether Minot Public School Superintendent created committee is a committee that basically has to comply with the open meetings requirements. And so in that opinion, the issue was the Minot Public School Superintendent created a committee to address precautions that Minot Public Schools could implement to keep schools safe following the COVID-19 pandemic and the closures that resulted from the pandemic. So it was a superintendent created committee. On that committee, the members included public health officials, parents, some staff members, and I assume the superintendent himself. No board members served on the committee, and none of them ever attended any of these, their committee meetings. So that's the stage. In analyzing this issue, the AG referenced two prior opinions that had been issued by the Attorney General regarding superintendent's cabinets, which in both of those prior opinions, it was determined that they're not board committees that are subject to open meetings laws because there was no delegation from the board, no delegation of responsibility. It was a superintendent created committee or a cabinet. And so the meetings of that cabinet did not need to comply with the open meetings requirements. So in analyzing the issue, the AG looked at those prior opinions and kind of said, hey, it's similar to this. The Minot Public School Superintendent was very clear, undisputed, that he had established that committee pursuant to his administrative responsibilities. There was no involvement from the board on the creation of the committee. And therefore, based on all of that, the committee did not meet the definition of a governing body, which means that administrative created committees do not need to comply with the open meetings requirements. This was some great clarification provided on these administrative committees. So I think we have going forward, we have some clarification. We have a little bit more certainty on those committees that are created by your administrative staff or your superintendent without involvement of the board in terms of the creation of the committee. I think it's pretty safe to say that those are likely not going to have to comply with the open meetings requirements. Again, in this case, in this situation, it was undisputed and very clear that the Minot Public School Board did not have any involvement in establishing or creating the committee or staffing the committee. And that seemed to be an important aspect. That was kind of the key, the linchpin on determining that the committee wasn't a governing body under the law that had to meet the open meetings requirements. So one of the questions I think that was left open by this opinion is what happens if, okay, you have your superintendent wants to create a committee, and you know what, he or she would really like the input of the perspective of a board member. So, the board has no involvement in creating the committee. They're not suggesting that the superintendent create this committee. It's the superintendent doing it on his or her own accord in conjunction with their administrative responsibilities, but they want to have a board member involved. I think based on the analysis and the opinion, I think in that case, under those circumstances, it would still not be a board committee, even if a board member is involved, because again, there's no delegation of responsibility from the board. So I think if you have a board member, on in that scenario, it doesn't trigger the open meetings requirements. But I feel like there's a slippery slope that could happen there. So again, the opinion did not analyze that in particular because again, there was no board member involvement either in the creation of the committee or even in the work of the committee. So that issue wasn't there in this opinion. But I think based on the analysis, I think we can take that step. If the superintendent is the one that creates the committee, staffs the committee, and happens to have one board member on there, I think in that case, it's probably still not subject to open meetings requirements. Okay, before we say goodbye, a final few more practice pointers. Find the ideal size of the committee that is going to make sense for the work that the committee is doing. So again, I think committee size can be kind of an impediment. If you start, adding more and more people onto the committee, I think that can be kind of work against the benefit that the committee is supposed to be providing to the board. Determine if that committee is actually necessary to help the board do its work. Again, don't create a committee just to create a committee because everybody's doing it. But again, committees can serve very important purposes, and I think they make a lot of sense, even in small districts, I think. But again, I think a lot of that can kind of depend on how much authority you've delegated to your superintendent, how much, it allows the board to kind of, again, dig into the issues a little bit more. And I think that can be very valuable to board members. It can really help with the board's work. You should be setting your committee meeting agendas in advance. Don't just say, hey, we should get together as a committee and see where we're at. Again, you're required to comply with the open meetings requirements, which again, likely every committee meeting is likely a special meeting. I think arguably you can maybe set regular committee board meetings every month. And if you do that at your annual committee or at your annual meeting in July for your standing committees, does that mean that those committee meetings are regular meetings? I haven't actually looked at that issue, but I hesitate to say yes. So you should be treating all of your committee meetings as special meetings and including the topics for discussion in your notices. So your agendas need to be in your notices. Another thing to think about is when you're creating these committees, even if it's a special committee, create job descriptions for your committee. And what I mean by that is you should really be thinking about what do we want as a board? What work do we want this committee to do, and kind of lay that out. It doesn't have to be extremely detailed, but you should have some forethought onto that, and that can help keep the committee in its lane, can help them work more efficiently when there's some clear direction from the board as to what it wants. The board should be regularly reviewing the committee's performance. So that can look a number of different ways. I like the idea of providing board members with committee meeting minutes so that they have at least some ability to keep advised of what the committee is doing. But, at your annual meeting, it's a great opportunity to kind of review the committee's performance over the prior year to see if it makes sense to continue that committee again for the next fiscal year. And then finally, public comment and participation at committee meetings. So it's very common for boards to allow for public comment and participation at their regular board meetings of the board. Some do it for special and regular meetings. Should you do it for committee meetings? Nothing in the law prohibits you from allowing public comment at your committee meetings. But I think there's probably good reason not to make that a fixed item on your agenda for committee meetings, because again, committee meetings, the purpose of them, at least one purpose, is to dig into the work of the board as a benefit of the board so that you can report back to the board. There is no final decision making going on at those committee meetings, or at least there shouldn't be. And so is there really a need for public comment at that time? I think public comment can certainly come at the board meeting in front of the full board so that the full board is aware. But there might be some special committee, maybe you create a special committee for that construction project. And one of the tasks is to gauge public support for a bond referendum. And so maybe at those committee meetings, you want to have some public comment. That might make a lot of sense, but it's just something to think about and think about if it'll work for you and maybe cause more problems than it would benefit to have that at your committee meetings. One final question. What if the board president assigns a board member to sit in as a representative to another administrative committee and just report updates to the board on the things they do, such as Booster Club, PTA, Curriculum Committee? Again, I think where this comes down to is the board, either by consensus, board action, board policy, delegating responsibility to a group of people, 2 or more people? That's when a committee is created for a board committee that must comply with the open meetings requirements. So if the board president says, hey, board member B, why don't you go sit in on this administrative committee and just report back? I think you can make the argument that there hasn't been board delegation. There's been maybe delegation from the board president, but, you know, so I think probably you haven't triggered or established a board committee that then triggers the open meetings requirements. But again, it's going to depend on the circumstances. And I encourage you to think about that when you're making these types of decisions. You can always reach out to your legal counsel to get an opinion as to whether something that you've done has created a committee that now you must worry about open meetings requirements. Something that you can do, and it might save you a lot of heartburn, or at least save you a report to the AG's office and maybe an opinion that you violated the open meetings requirements, which is typically not fun. So it looks like I've answered all of your questions. I really appreciate you all asking such great questions. I honestly didn't think I have enough material to go a whole hour, and we've gone over the time. So thank you so much. Our next Brunch and Learn is going to be on Wednesday, December 21st, again at 9 a.m. And we're going to be doing a 2023 legislative session preview. And I think Alexis, our executive director, is going to head that discussion. So again, go to our website and the resources tab, and the events tab is also another place you can get lunch and learn information to register for that session. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all meeting with me today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.